In the dusty archives of the Tombstone Historical Society, librarian Margaret Wells was cataloguing a collection of old photographs donated by the estate of a local ranching family when she discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It was a seemingly innocent family reunion photograph from 1912, showing 3 generations of the Morrison family gathered on the front porch of their ranch house outside Tombstone, Arizona. But what Margaret found when she researched the people in that photograph defied everything she thought she knew about life and death. The photograph had been taken on a bright Sunday afternoon in September 1912, according to the careful notation written on the back in faded ink. The Morrison family had gathered to celebrate the harvest and the engagement of the youngest daughter, Elizabeth, to a local cattle rancher named Thomas Whitman. 15 family members were arranged on the wooden porch, dressed in their finest clothes, with the men wearing dark suits and the women in long dresses with high collars typical of the era. At first glance, it appeared to be a perfectly normal family portrait from the early 20th century. The patriarch, Samuel Morrison, stood proudly in the center with his hand on the shoulder of his eldest son, Robert. His wife, Martha, sat in a wooden chair beside him, her hands folded in her lap, wearing a navy blue dress with pearl buttons. Their children and grandchildren were arranged around them in the traditional formal pose that was common for family photographs of that time period. The ranch house behind them was a sturdy 2-story structure built from local timber and stone with a wide front porch that provided shade from the harsh Arizona sun. Wooden rocking chairs and a small table suggested that this was a place where the family gathered in the evenings to watch the sunset over the desert landscape. The setting was quintessentially American frontier, representing the dreams and aspirations of families who had ventured west to build new lives in the untamed territories. But as Margaret examined the photograph more closely, she noticed something peculiar about one of the women in the picture. Seated in the front row was an elderly woman with silver hair and a kind face, wearing a black dress with intricate lace details. According to the handwritten names on the back of the photograph, this was Grandmother Rose Morrison, Samuel's mother and the family matriarch. The woman appeared completely natural in the photograph, her posture relaxed and her expression warm and loving as she gazed at the camera. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her black dress was arranged carefully around her feet. She seemed to be the very picture of a beloved grandmother enjoying a special family gathering, surrounded by the children and grandchildren who meant everything to her. Margaret decided to research the Morrison family history to learn more about the people in the photograph. She began by searching through the local cemetery records, birth and death certificates, and newspaper archives that documented the lives of Tombstone's early settlers. The Morrison family had been prominent in the area since the 1870s, when Samuel's father, William Morrison, had established one of the first successful cattle ranches in the Arizona Territory. The family had arrived in Arizona during the height of the Apache Wars, when the territory was still a dangerous and largely unsettled frontier. They had built their ranch from nothing, clearing the land, constructing buildings, and establishing herds of cattle that would eventually make them one of the most prosperous families in the region. Their success had come at a tremendous cost, however, as they had faced constant threats from hostile Native American tribes, harsh weather conditions, and the countless challenges that confronted pioneer families in the American Southwest. William Morrison had been killed in an Apache raid in 1885, leaving his wife Rose to manage the ranch and raise their children alone. Against all odds, she had not only kept the operation running, but had expanded it significantly, making shrewd business decisions that had established the Morrison Ranch as one of the most successful cattle operations in southern Arizona. What Margaret discovered next made her blood run cold. According to the official records, Rose Morrison had died on March 15, 1911, more than a year before the family reunion photograph was taken. The local newspaper, the Tombstone Epitaph, had published her obituary, describing her as a beloved mother and grandmother who had helped establish one of the first successful cattle ranches in the Arizona Territory. She had been buried in the Tombstone Cemetery with a proper funeral service attended by dozens of family members and friends. The obituary painted a picture of a remarkable woman who had overcome tremendous hardships to help build a thriving ranch in the harsh desert environment. Rose had arrived in Arizona as a young bride in 1868, when the territory was still largely unsettled and dangerous. She had survived Apache raids, drought, disease, and the countless challenges that faced pioneer families in the American Southwest. The newspaper account described how Rose had been instrumental in the success of the Morrison Ranch, working alongside her husband to build their cattle operation from a small homestead into one of the largest and most profitable ranches in southern Arizona. She had been known for her business acumen, her charitable work in the community, and her fierce devotion to her family. Her death had been mourned throughout the region, with tributes pouring in from neighbors, business associates, and friends who had known her for decades. Margaret stared at the photograph in disbelief. How could a woman who had been dead for over a year appear so clearly and naturally in a family portrait? She examined the image under a magnifying glass, looking for any signs of photographic manipulation or double exposure that might explain the impossible presence of the deceased grandmother. But the photograph appeared to be completely authentic. Rose Morrison was not a ghostly apparition or a faded overlay superimposed on the original image. She appeared as solid and real as every other family member in the picture. Her clothing cast shadows on the porch floor, her hands rested naturally on the arms of her chair, and her expression showed the same warm smile that characterized the other family members. The photographic technique of the era made manipulation extremely difficult, if not impossible. The image had been captured on a glass plate negative using a large format camera, and the developing process required precise chemical procedures that left little room for trickery. Margaret had examined hundreds of photographs from this period, and she could recognize the telltale signs of double exposure or composite imaging. This photograph showed none of those characteristics. Margaret decided to investigate further. She contacted the Morrison family descendants who still lived in the area, hoping to learn more about the circumstances surrounding the mysterious photograph. What she discovered was even more disturbing than the original anomaly. According to family stories passed down through the generations, the 1912 reunion had been organized specifically to honor the memory of Grandmother Rose, who had been the heart and soul of the Morrison family. The gathering was meant to be a celebration of her life and the legacy she had left behind. But multiple family members who attended the reunion insisted that Rose had actually been present at the event. The family had planned the reunion for months, sending letters to relatives scattered across the Southwest, and making elaborate preparations for what they expected to be a bittersweet gathering. They had arranged for a photographer to document the event, prepared Rose's favorite foods, and even set up her favorite rocking chair on the porch in her memory. But according to the family accounts, they had not expected her to actually occupy that chair. Margaret interviewed Dorothy Morrison, Rose's great-granddaughter, who was 93 years old and one of the last surviving members of the family who had personal memories of the early ranch days. Dorothy lived in a small house on the outskirts of Tombstone, surrounded by family photographs and memorabilia from the pioneer era. Her account of the 1912 reunion was both fascinating and terrifying. "I was just a little girl then, maybe 8 years old," Dorothy recalled, her voice trembling with emotion as she sat in her favorite rocking chair. "But I remember that day so clearly because it was the first time I had seen great-grandmother Rose since her funeral. She was sitting right there on the porch with the rest of the family, smiling and talking just like she always did. I ran up to hug her, and she felt warm and real, just like she had when she was alive." Dorothy's eyes grew distant as she recalled the memories that had stayed with her for more than 8 decades. She described how Rose had been wearing her favorite black dress, the same one she had been buried in, and how her silver hair had been arranged in the familiar style that the family remembered. But there had been something different about her appearance, something that suggested she was no longer entirely of this world. She had this peaceful look about her, like she had found something wonderful that the rest of us couldn't see, Dorothy continued, her weathered hands clasping a faded photograph of Rose from her living years. Her eyes seemed to sparkle with a kind of inner light, and when she smiled, it was like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. She seemed happier than I had ever seen her, even when she was alive. Dorothy explained that none of the adults at the reunion had seemed surprised by Rose's presence. They had talked with her, laughed at her stories, and included her in all the family conversations as if nothing unusual was happening. It was only the children who seemed to notice that something was different about their beloved grandmother. The strange thing was that she looked exactly the same as she had before she died, Dorothy continued. She was wearing the same black dress she had been buried in, and her hair was arranged in the same style. But she seemed happy and peaceful, not scary or ghostly like you might expect. She told us stories about the old days and gave us advice about our lives, just like she always had. Dorothy recalled specific conversations she had with Rose during the reunion, discussions about her schoolwork, her dreams for the future, and the importance of maintaining family traditions. Rose had spoken about the early days of the ranch, sharing stories that only she could have known, details about the family's struggles and triumphs that had never been written down or shared with outsiders. She told me about the time when the Apache raiders came to the ranch when my grandfather was just a baby, Dorothy remembered. She described how she and my great-grandfather had hidden in the root cellar with the children, while the warriors searched the house. She talked about the fear she had felt, but also about the determination to protect her family no matter what happened. These were stories that no one else in the family knew, details that had never been shared before. The story that Rose had told Dorothy was particularly chilling, because it involved events that had occurred decades before Dorothy was born, and the details were so specific and vivid that they could not have been invented or embellished over time. Rose had described the sound of the Apache ponies' hooves on the hard-packed earth, the smell of smoke from the burning outbuildings, and the terrifying silence that had fallen over the ranch as the raiders searched for the family. She told me how she had covered my grandfather's mouth with her hand to keep him from crying, and how she had prayed to God that the warriors wouldn't find the hidden entrance to the root cellar. Dorothy continued. She described the hours they had spent in that dark, cramped space, listening to the sounds of destruction above them, and wondering if they would ever see daylight again. When she told me this story, I could see the fear in her eyes, even though it had happened so many years before. Rose had also shared details about the aftermath of the raid, describing how the family had emerged from their hiding place to find their home partially destroyed and several of their cattle stolen. She had told Dorothy about the difficult decision to stay on the ranch despite the danger, and about the months of rebuilding that had followed. These were intimate family memories that had never been recorded in any official documents or shared with anyone outside the immediate family. Margaret was initially skeptical of Dorothy's account, thinking that childhood memories could be unreliable and that the elderly woman might be confusing different events from her past. But as she continued her research, she discovered that other family members had similar memories of Rose's mysterious appearance at the 1912 reunion. James Morrison, Rose's grandson, who had been 25 years old at the time of the reunion, had written about the event in his personal diary. Margaret found his journal in the family papers that had been donated to the Historical Society, and his account corroborated Dorothy's story in disturbing detail. "Mother Rose joined us for the family gathering today," James had written in his careful handwriting. "It has been over a year since we laid her to rest, but she appeared on the porch this morning as if she had never left us. Father says we should not speak of this to outsiders, as they would not understand. But I cannot help but feel blessed that she chose to return to us for this special day." The diary entries continued for several days after the reunion, describing how Rose had stayed with the family for nearly a week before disappearing as mysteriously as she had arrived. James wrote about conversations he had with his deceased grandmother, advice she had given him about his upcoming marriage, and stories she had told about the early days of the ranch. "She spoke to me about the responsibility of carrying on the family name and traditions," James had written. "She reminded me of the sacrifices that previous generations had made to establish our place in this harsh land, and she urged me to honor their memory by continuing to build upon what they had started." Her words carried a weight and wisdom that seemed to come from beyond the grave. James described how Rose had participated in the daily activities of the ranch during her week-long visit. She had helped with cooking meals, mending clothes, and caring for the younger children. She had walked through the fields and pastures, inspecting the cattle and offering suggestions for improving the ranch operations. To all outward appearances, she had resumed her role as the family matriarch, as if death had been merely a temporary absence. "The most remarkable thing about her presence was how natural it seemed," James had written. "After the initial shock of seeing her again, we all fell back into our old patterns of behavior. She resumed her place at the head of the table during meals, offered her opinions on family matters, and provided the same loving guidance that we had always relied upon." It was as if the past year of mourning had been nothing more than a bad dream. James also described specific incidents that demonstrated Rose's continued connection to the physical world. She had helped him repair a broken fence post, showing him techniques that she had learned from his grandfather decades earlier. She had assisted his wife with preserving fruit from the orchard, sharing recipes and methods that had been passed down through generations of Morrison women. These were not the actions of a ghostly apparition, but of a living, breathing person who was fully engaged with the world around her. One particularly detailed entry described how Rose had helped James make a difficult decision about selling a portion of the ranch to pay off debts that had accumulated during a difficult economic period. She had provided specific advice about which parcels of land to sell and which to keep, based on her intimate knowledge of the property and its potential for future development. Mother Rose walked with me through the entire ranch, pointing out areas that would be valuable for future expansion and others that could be sold without compromising the core operation, James had written. Her knowledge of the land was extraordinary, as if she could see things that the rest of us had missed. She showed me underground springs that I had never known existed, and she identified areas where the soil was particularly fertile for growing crops. Margaret found similar accounts in letters, written by other family members in the weeks following the reunion. They all described Rose's presence as natural and comforting, not frightening or supernatural. She had participated in family meals, helped with household chores, and even assisted with the wedding preparations for Elizabeth's upcoming marriage. One letter, written by Martha Morrison to her sister in California, provided particularly detailed information about Rose's posthumous visit. Mother Morrison has been with us for the past week, Martha had written. I know this must sound impossible, but she appeared at our family gathering and has remained to help with Elizabeth's wedding preparations. She seems as real and present as she ever was, offering advice and sharing in our joy as if death had been merely a temporary absence. Martha's letter went on to describe specific interactions she had with Rose during the visit. She helped me plan the wedding menu, suggesting dishes that she remembered from her own wedding many years ago. She showed me how to arrange the flowers in the traditional way that her mother had taught her, and she shared stories about the courtship rituals of her generation. Her knowledge and experience were invaluable in making Elizabeth's wedding a truly memorable occasion. The letter also revealed that Rose had expressed concerns about certain aspects of Elizabeth's engagement, offering insights about the young man's character and family background that proved to be remarkably accurate. Mother Morrison warned me about certain tendencies in the young man's family, Martha had written. She spoke of patterns of behavior that she had observed in previous generations, and her warnings proved to be prophetic when difficulties arose later in the marriage. Rose had apparently spent considerable time with Elizabeth during her visit, sharing wisdom about marriage and family life that the young woman would carry with her for the rest of her life. She had taught Elizabeth traditional skills that had been passed down through generations of Morrison women, including techniques for preserving food, caring for livestock, and managing household finances during difficult times. Elizabeth herself had written about her grandmother's visit in a letter to a friend in Phoenix. Grandmother Rose has returned to us for my engagement celebration, she had written. I know this must sound strange, but she is here with us as real as life itself. She has been teaching me the old ways of managing a household and caring for a family. Her presence has brought such comfort to all of us, especially during this time of change and uncertainty. But perhaps the most compelling evidence was a letter written by the local photographer who had taken the family portrait. Margaret discovered his correspondence in the files of the Tombstone photography studio that had operated in the early 1900s. The photographer, a man named William Hayes, had written to a colleague in Phoenix describing the unusual circumstances of the Morrison family session. I have been taking family portraits for over 20 years, Hayes had written, but I have never encountered anything quite like what happened at the Morrison ranch last week. The family insisted that I include their deceased grandmother in the photograph, and I assumed they wanted me to create some sort of memorial composite image. But when I arrived at the ranch, the old woman was sitting right there with the rest of the family, as real as anyone else in the picture. Hayes went on to describe how he had initially thought the family was playing some sort of elaborate joke on him, perhaps using an actress to impersonate the dead grandmother. But as he set up his equipment and prepared to take the photograph, he became convinced that he was looking at something genuinely supernatural. The woman cast a shadow. She breathed naturally, and she responded to my directions just like any other subject, Hayes continued in his letter. But there was something about her that seemed otherworldly. Her eyes had a depth and wisdom that seemed to come from beyond the grave, and when she smiled, I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm Arizona sunshine. The photographer had taken several pictures that day, and all of them showed Rose Morrison sitting naturally with her family. Hayes had developed the photographs in his studio, expecting to find that the mysterious woman had somehow failed to appear on the film. But the images showed her as clearly as everyone else in the family group. Hayes described his confusion and fear as he processed the photographs in his darkroom. He had checked and rechecked his equipment, examined the glass plates for defects, and even consulted with other photographers about possible explanations for what he had captured. But every analysis confirmed that he had photographed something that should not have been possible. I have spent sleepless nights wondering about what I witnessed at the Morrison Ranch, Hayes had written. I am a man of science and reason, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs, but I cannot deny the evidence of my own eyes and my own photographic plates. I captured an image of a woman who had been dead for over a year, sitting peacefully with her living family members, as if death had no power over the bonds of love and kinship. Hayes had been so disturbed by the experience that he had considered destroying the photographs, fearing that they might bring him unwanted attention or accusations of fraud. But his professional integrity had prevented him from destroying what he knew to be authentic images, regardless of how impossible they seemed. The photographer had also noted other unusual aspects of the session that had troubled him. He had observed that Rose Morrison seemed to be aware of photographic techniques and procedures that had been developed after her death, suggesting knowledge that she could not have possessed during her lifetime. She had positioned herself in ways that created optimal lighting and composition, demonstrating an understanding of photography that seemed to transcend her earthly experience. Margaret decided to examine the original glass plate negatives that Hayes had used to take the photographs. She found them in the archives of the photography studio, carefully preserved in their original storage cases. When she held the negatives up to the light, she could see Rose Morrison's image clearly etched in the photographic emulsion, proving that the woman had been physically present when the pictures were taken. The glass plates showed no signs of manipulation or double exposure. The image of Rose Morrison was integrated seamlessly with the rest of the family group, with proper lighting, shadows, and perspective that would have been impossible to fake using the photographic techniques available in 1912. The emulsion showed the characteristic grain structure and tonal qualities of authentic period photography, with none of the telltale signs of modern digital manipulation or composite imaging. But the mystery deepened when Margaret discovered that Rose Morrison had appeared in other family photographs taken after her death. She found images from Christmas gatherings, birthday celebrations, and other family events spanning several years, all showing the deceased grandmother participating in family activities as if she had never died. One particularly striking photograph from Christmas 1913 showed Rose Morrison helping to decorate the family Christmas tree, her hands clearly visible as she placed ornaments on the branches. Another image from a 4th of July celebration in 1914 depicted her sitting on the porch with other family members, watching children play in the yard. In each photograph, she appeared as solid and real as the living family members around her. A photograph from Easter 1915 showed Rose Morrison participating in an egg hunt with the younger children, her face animated with joy as she helped them search for hidden treats. The image captured her in mid-motion, reaching toward a brightly colored egg that had been concealed behind a fence post. Her dress rustled in the desert breeze, and her silver hair caught the morning sunlight in a way that seemed entirely natural and lifelike. Another remarkable image from a harvest celebration in 1916 showed Rose Morrison working alongside other family members to gather crops from the ranch's vegetable garden. She was shown bending over to pick tomatoes, her movements fluid and natural as she filled a wicker basket with the ripe fruit. The photograph captured details that would have been impossible to fake, including the way her shadow fell across the ground and the realistic interaction between her hands and the vegetables she was harvesting. Margaret also discovered a photograph from a barn raising in 1917 where Rose Morrison could be seen helping to prepare food for the workers. She was standing at a long table, slicing bread and arranging it on platters, while other women worked beside her to prepare the meal. The image showed her engaged in animated conversation with the other women, her face bright with laughter, as she shared in the communal activity. The Morrison family had apparently accepted Rose's periodic returns as a natural part of their lives. They had set a place for her at family dinners, included her in holiday celebrations, and consulted her on important family decisions. The children had grown up thinking it was perfectly normal for their great-grandmother to visit from beyond the grave. Margaret's investigation revealed that Rose Morrison's posthumous appearances had continued for nearly a decade after her death. Family members reported seeing her at weddings, funerals, and other significant family events. She had allegedly provided comfort during times of illness, offered guidance during difficult decisions, and maintained her role as the family matriarch, even from beyond the grave. The appearances followed a consistent pattern. Rose would arrive unexpectedly, usually during times of family celebration or crisis, and would remain for several days or weeks before disappearing again. She never spoke about where she went when she wasn't with the family, and attempts to question her about the afterlife were met with gentle deflection. Family members described her as being exactly the same as she had been in life, with the same personality, mannerisms, and memories. She would tell stories about the early days of the ranch, offer advice based on her years of experience, and express concern for the welfare of her descendants. The only difference was a sense of peace and serenity that seemed to surround her, as if death had freed her from the worries and burdens of earthly existence. She seemed lighter somehow, Dorothy Morrison had explained during one of Margaret's interviews. Not physically lighter, but spiritually lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She still cared deeply about the family and wanted to help us with our problems, but she didn't seem to carry the same burden of responsibility that she had when she was alive. It was as if she had found a perfect balance between caring for us and being at peace with herself. Dorothy also described how Rose's appearances had evolved over the years, becoming less frequent but more meaningful as time passed. In the early years after her death, she would visit us quite often, sometimes staying for weeks at a time, Dorothy recalled. But as the years went by, her visits became shorter and less frequent, as if she was gradually letting go of her earthly attachments and moving on to whatever awaited her in the next world. The family had developed certain rituals and traditions around Rose's visits. They would always set her place at the table during family meals, even when she wasn't physically present, as a way of honoring her memory and keeping her spirit close to them. When she did appear, they would gather around her to hear her stories and seek her advice, treating these moments as precious gifts that might not come again. Rose's appearances seemed to be triggered by specific events or emotional states within the family. She would often appear during times of crisis, such as when family members were ill or facing difficult decisions. She would also manifest during times of celebration, such as weddings, births, and holidays, as if she didn't want to miss these important family milestones. But the appearances had gradually become less frequent as the years passed. The last confirmed sighting of Rose Morrison had been at her great-grandson's wedding in 1921, nearly 10 years after her death. After that, she had apparently found peace and moved on to whatever realm awaited her in the afterlife. The final appearance had been particularly poignant, according to family accounts. Rose had arrived at the wedding ceremony just as the bride and groom were exchanging vows, and she had remained throughout the celebration that followed. Family members described her as being more radiant and peaceful than they had ever seen her, as if she had finally completed whatever mission had kept her tied to the earthly realm. She danced at the wedding reception, Dorothy remembered with tears in her eyes. I can still see her waltzing with my great-grandfather's spirit, even though he had been dead for many years. It was as if they were finally reunited and ready to move on together to whatever comes after this life. After that night, we never saw her again, but we all knew that she was at peace. Margaret tried to find rational explanations for the Morrison family's experiences. She researched cases of mass hallucination, shared delusions, and other psychological phenomena that might account for multiple people believing they had seen and interacted with a dead person. But none of the scientific explanations seemed to fit the evidence she had uncovered. The photographs were real, taken by a professional photographer using standard equipment and techniques of the era. The family members who had witnessed Rose's appearances were mentally healthy individuals with no history of psychological problems. The accounts were consistent across multiple witnesses and were documented in contemporaneous letters and diary entries. Margaret also investigated the possibility that someone had been impersonating Rose Morrison, perhaps as part of an elaborate hoax or family tradition, but the physical resemblance would have had to be perfect, and the impersonator would have needed intimate knowledge of family history and personal details that only Rose herself could have known. The more Margaret researched, the more convinced she became that the Morrison family had experienced something genuinely supernatural. The evidence was too extensive and too consistent to be explained away as fraud, delusion, or misidentification. As Margaret delved deeper into the Morrison family history, she discovered that Rose had been an extraordinary woman even during her lifetime. She had been one of the first female landowners in the Arizona Territory, successfully managing the family ranch after her husband's death in an Apache raid in 1885. She had been known throughout the region for her business acumen, her charitable work, and her fierce devotion to her family. Rose had single-handedly kept the ranch operating during some of the most difficult years in Arizona's history. She had negotiated with cattle buyers, managed the ranch hands, and made crucial decisions about land use and livestock management. Her success had been remarkable for a woman in an era when such responsibilities were typically handled exclusively by men. The ranch record showed that under Rose's management, the Morrison cattle operation had not only survived but thrived during the challenging economic conditions of the late 19th century. She had expanded the herd, improved the grazing lands, and established profitable relationships with cattle buyers throughout the Southwest. Her business correspondence revealed a sharp mind and a keen understanding of market conditions that would have been impressive in any era. Rose had also been deeply involved in the local community, serving on the school board and helping to establish the first church in the area. She had organized relief efforts during times of drought and hardship, opening her home to families who had lost everything to Apache raids or natural disasters. Her generosity and compassion had made her beloved throughout the region, and her death had been mourned by people from all walks of life. Local Native American tribes had regarded Rose Morrison with a mixture of respect and fear. They had called her the woman who walks between worlds, believing that she possessed supernatural powers that allowed her to communicate with spirits and see into the future. Some tribal elders had predicted that her death would not be the end of her influence over the living world. Margaret found records of Rose's interactions with local Apache and Tohono O'odham tribes, including accounts of her serving as a mediator during conflicts between Native Americans and white settlers. She had been known for her fair dealing and her ability to understand different perspectives, qualities that had earned her respect from both communities. She had a gift for seeing into people's hearts, one tribal elder had reportedly said about Rose. She could understand what they needed and what they feared, even when they couldn't express it themselves. We believed that the spirits spoke to her and through her, giving her wisdom that came from beyond the world of the living. The tribal accounts also described Rose's involvement in traditional healing practices and spiritual ceremonies. She had learned herbal medicine from Native American healers and had incorporated their techniques into her own medical practice. Some tribal members believed that her knowledge of both worlds, the white man's world and the spirit world, had given her unique powers that transcended normal human limitations. Margaret found records indicating that Rose had been interested in spiritualism and the occult during her lifetime. She had attended seances, consulted with mediums, and studied books about communication with the dead. Some family members believed that her knowledge of spiritual matters had enabled her to return from the grave to continue caring for her loved ones. Rose's personal library, which had been preserved by the family, contained numerous books on spiritualism, metaphysics, and communication with the dead. She had corresponded with prominent spiritualists of her era and had even hosted seances at the ranch house. Her interest in these subjects had been unusual for a frontier woman, but it had been consistent with her reputation as someone who possessed supernatural insights and abilities. Among Rose's papers, Margaret found detailed accounts of seances that had been conducted at the Morrison Ranch. These sessions had allegedly produced communications from deceased family members and friends, providing comfort and guidance to the living participants. Rose had served as a medium during many of these sessions, channeling messages from the spirit world with remarkable accuracy and detail. One particularly detailed account described a séance conducted in 1909, 2 years before Rose's death, during which she had allegedly received messages from her deceased husband about the future of the ranch. The spirit had provided specific instructions about land management and livestock breeding that had proven to be remarkably prescient when implemented by the family. The Morrison Ranch itself had a reputation for supernatural activity that extended far beyond Rose's posthumous appearances. Previous owners of the land had reported strange lights, unexplained sounds, and ghostly figures wandering the property. Native American legends spoke of the area as a place where the boundary between the living and dead worlds was particularly thin. The land had been the site of several tragic events over the years, including battles between settlers and Apache warriors, deaths from disease and accidents, and the hardships that were common to frontier life. Some local residents believed that these traumatic events had created a spiritual imprint on the landscape that made supernatural phenomena more likely to occur. Margaret decided to visit the site of the former Morrison Ranch to see if she could find any additional clues about the family's supernatural experiences. The original ranch house had been demolished decades earlier, but the foundation stones were still visible among the desert scrub. Local residents told her that the area was still considered haunted, with occasional reports of ghostly figures and unexplained phenomena. As Margaret stood on the site where the 1912 family reunion had taken place, she felt a strange chill despite the warm Arizona sunshine. She could almost imagine the Morrison family gathered on their front porch, with Rose Morrison sitting peacefully among her descendants, as if death had been merely a temporary inconvenience. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mountains and the occasional saguaro cactus. It was a harsh and unforgiving environment that had tested the resolve of countless pioneer families. Margaret could understand why the bonds between family members would have been particularly strong in such a challenging setting. She spent several hours exploring the ruins of the ranch, looking for any physical evidence that might shed light on the supernatural events that had occurred there. She found fragments of pottery, pieces of old tools, and other artifacts from the pioneer era, but nothing that provided any clues about Rose Morrison's posthumous appearances. As the sun began to set over the desert, Margaret felt a presence watching her from among the ruins. She turned around quickly, but saw nothing except the shadows cast by the remaining foundation stones. Yet the feeling persisted, as if someone was observing her investigation with interest and approval. The sensation was so strong that Margaret found herself speaking aloud to the empty desert. "Rose Morrison, if you're here, I want you to know that I'm trying to understand what happened to your family. I want to tell your story in a way that honors your memory and helps people understand that love can transcend even death itself." For a moment, the desert was completely silent, with no sound except the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then Margaret heard what sounded like a woman's voice, soft and gentle, carried on the evening breeze. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakably one of approval and gratitude. The more Margaret learned about the Morrison family and their supernatural experiences, the more she began to question her own understanding of life and death. The evidence was overwhelming that Rose Morrison had somehow managed to return from the grave to maintain her connection with her family. But the implications of this possibility were staggering and challenged everything that modern science taught about the nature of human existence. Margaret's research attracted the attention of paranormal investigators and researchers who were interested in documenting cases of life after death. She received visits from university professors, ghost hunters, and spiritualists who wanted to examine the Morrison family photographs and interview the surviving family members. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a professor of psychology from the University of Arizona, spent several weeks in Tombstone studying the Morrison case. She interviewed Dorothy Morrison and other family descendants, examined the photographic evidence, and researched the historical context of the supernatural events. "This case is remarkable for its consistency and documentation," Dr. Hartwell concluded in her report. "The evidence suggests that the Morrison family experienced genuine paranormal phenomena that cannot be easily explained by conventional psychological or scientific theories. The photographic evidence is particularly compelling, as it provides objective documentation of events that multiple witnesses claim to have experienced. Dr. Hartwell's investigation included psychological evaluations of the surviving family members, analysis of the historical documents, and consultation with experts in photographic authentication. Her findings supported the conclusion that the Morrison family had experienced genuine supernatural phenomena that could not be explained by conventional scientific theories. Some researchers proposed that Rose Morrison's appearances were examples of what they called crisis apparitions, supernatural manifestations that occurred when deceased individuals felt compelled to return to help their living relatives through difficult times. Others suggested that the family's strong emotional bonds had somehow enabled Rose to maintain a connection with the physical world even after her death. The theory of crisis apparitions was supported by the timing of Rose's appearances, which seemed to coincide with important family events or times of emotional stress. Her presence at the 1912 reunion, for example, had occurred during a period when the family was dealing with the engagement of the youngest daughter and the challenges of maintaining the ranch during a difficult economic period. Dr. Michael Thompson, a researcher specializing in near-death experiences and consciousness studies, proposed that Rose Morrison's appearances might be evidence of what he called consciousness persistence, the idea that human awareness could survive physical death under certain circumstances. He suggested that Rose's strong emotional attachment to her family had enabled her consciousness to maintain a connection with the physical world even after her body had died. Skeptics argued that the Morrison family experiences could be explained by a combination of wishful thinking, false memories, and photographic anomalies. They pointed out that grief could cause people to see and hear things that weren't really there, and that old photographs could be misleading due to poor image quality and developing techniques. Dr. Robert Mitchell, a skeptical researcher from the University of California, examined the photographic evidence and concluded that the images could have been manipulated using techniques available in the early 1900s. He suggested that the photographer might have used double exposure or other methods to create the illusion of Rose Morrison's presence in the family portraits. But Margaret had examined the evidence too thoroughly to dismiss it as mere illusion or fraud. The photographs were authentic, the witness accounts were credible, and the documentation was extensive. Something extraordinary had happened to the Morrison family, something that defied conventional explanations about the nature of death and the afterlife. As word of Margaret's research spread, she began receiving reports of similar cases from other families throughout the American Southwest. Apparently, the Morrison family's experiences were not unique. Other families had reported visits from deceased relatives, particularly in areas with strong Native American spiritual traditions and histories of supernatural activity. Margaret documented dozens of cases involving posthumous family appearances, creating a database of supernatural encounters that spanned several decades and multiple generations. The patterns she discovered suggested that certain families, particularly those with strong emotional bonds and spiritual beliefs, were more likely to experience visits from deceased relatives. The research revealed that these supernatural family reunions typically occurred during times of celebration or crisis, when the emotional intensity of the living family members was particularly high. Weddings, funerals, births, and other significant life events seemed to create conditions that enabled the dead to return and participate in family activities. Margaret also discovered that the appearances were usually temporary, lasting anywhere from a few hours to several weeks before the deceased individual would disappear again. The visits seemed to serve specific purposes, such as providing comfort during times of grief, offering guidance during difficult decisions, or simply maintaining family connections across the boundary between life and death. One particularly interesting case involved the Hernandez family of Tucson, whose deceased patriarch had allegedly returned to help his sons resolve a bitter dispute over the family business. According to family accounts, the old man had appeared at a family meeting and had provided specific instructions for dividing the business assets in a way that satisfied all parties involved. Another case involved the Thompson family of Phoenix, whose deceased matriarch had reportedly appeared at her granddaughter's wedding to offer her blessing and share family traditions that had been forgotten after her death. The woman had allegedly provided detailed instructions for preparing traditional wedding foods and had shared stories about the family's history that no living relative had known. A third case involved the Rodriguez family of Tucson, whose deceased grandmother had reportedly returned to help care for a sick grandchild. Family members claimed that the woman had appeared during the child's illness and had provided traditional remedies and healing techniques that had helped the child recover. The grandmother had allegedly remained with the family until the child was completely well, then had disappeared as mysteriously as she had arrived. The Morrison family case became one of the most well-documented examples of posthumous family visitation in the paranormal research literature. The combination of photographic evidence, multiple witness accounts, and contemporaneous documentation made it difficult for even the most skeptical researchers to dismiss the case entirely. Margaret's investigation had revealed that death might not be the absolute end that most people believed it to be. The Morrison family's experiences suggested that love, family bonds, and spiritual connections could transcend the grave, allowing deceased individuals to maintain relationships with their living relatives under certain circumstances. The 1912 family reunion photograph remained in the Tombstone Historical Society archives, serving as a tangible reminder that the boundary between life and death might be more permeable than anyone had imagined. Visitors to the museum often stared at the image in wonder, trying to comprehend how a woman who had been buried for over a year could appear so naturally and peacefully among her living family members. Margaret continued her research into supernatural family phenomena for the rest of her career, documenting hundreds of similar cases and building a comprehensive understanding of how the dead might maintain connections with the living world. Her work contributed to a growing body of evidence, suggesting that consciousness could survive physical death and that family relationships could extend beyond the grave. The Morrison family story became a testament to the power of love and family bonds to transcend even death itself. Rose Morrison's determination to remain connected with her descendants had enabled her to return from the grave and continue fulfilling her role as the family matriarch, providing guidance, comfort, and support to multiple generations of her loved ones. Years later, when Margaret was nearing retirement, she received a letter from the last surviving member of the Morrison family. Dorothy Morrison, now in her late 90s, wanted to share one final detail about her great-grandmother's supernatural visits that she had never told anyone before. "Great-grandmother Rose told me something during that 1912 reunion that I've never forgotten," Dorothy wrote in her shaky handwriting. "She said that love was the strongest force in the universe, stronger even than death itself. She said that as long as family members remembered and loved each other, they would never truly be separated, no matter what happened to their physical bodies." Dorothy's letter concluded with a message that sent chills down Margaret's spine. "She also told me that when my time comes to cross over, she'll be waiting for me on the other side, along with all the other family members who have gone before. She said that death is not an ending, but just another kind of family reunion, one that lasts forever." Margaret realized that her investigation into the Morrison family mystery had revealed something profound about the nature of human existence and the power of family love. The 1912 photograph was not just evidence of a supernatural anomaly, but proof that the bonds between family members could transcend the physical world and continue into whatever realm awaited beyond death. The Morrison family had been blessed with a gift that few people ever experienced: the knowledge that their loved ones continued to exist and care for them even after death. Rose Morrison's posthumous appearances had provided her family with comfort, guidance, and the assurance that their relationships would continue beyond the grave. As Margaret looked at the 1912 family reunion photograph one last time before retiring, she noticed something she had never seen before. In the background of the image, barely visible in the shadows of the ranch house, were the faint outlines of other figures. They appeared to be family members from even earlier generations, watching over the reunion from the spirit world. Margaret realized that the Morrison family gathering had been more than just a reunion of the living. It had been a convergence of multiple generations, with deceased family members returning to participate in the celebration alongside their living descendants. The photograph had captured a moment when the boundary between life and death had temporarily dissolved, allowing the entire Morrison family to be together once again. The discovery reinforced Margaret's conclusion that the Morrison family case was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger phenomenon involving the continued existence of human consciousness after death. The evidence suggested that family love could create bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds, enabling deceased individuals to maintain relationships with their living relatives. Margaret's research had revealed that the American Southwest, with its rich Native American spiritual traditions and history of supernatural activity, was particularly conducive to these types of paranormal family encounters. The combination of strong family bonds, spiritual beliefs, and the unique energy of the desert landscape seemed to create conditions that enabled the dead to return and interact with the living. The Morrison family story became a source of comfort for many people who had lost loved ones, providing hope that death was not the end of family relationships, but simply a transition to a different form of existence. The 1912 photograph served as tangible proof that love could transcend the grave, and that family reunions could continue even after death had separated family members. Margaret's investigation had transformed her understanding of life and death, convincing her that human consciousness was far more resilient and enduring than most people believed. The Morrison family's experiences suggested that the soul could survive physical death and maintain connections with the living world through the power of love and family bonds. As Margaret packed up her research files and prepared to leave the Tombstone Historical Society for the last time, she felt a sense of peace and wonder about the mysteries she had uncovered. The Morrison family case had shown her that death was not something to be feared, but simply another chapter in the ongoing story of human existence and family love. The 1912 family reunion photograph would continue to inspire and mystify future researchers, serving as a permanent reminder that the boundary between life and death might be far more permeable than anyone had ever imagined. Rose Morrison's posthumous appearance in the family portrait had provided evidence that love could conquer even death itself, enabling family relationships to continue across the threshold between the physical and spiritual worlds. In her final report on the Morrison family case, Margaret wrote, "The evidence suggests that consciousness survives physical death and that the bonds of family love can transcend the grave. The Morrison family's experiences provide hope that our relationships with loved ones continue beyond death and that the family unit remains intact even when separated by the ultimate boundary between life and death." The Morrison family ranch may have crumbled into ruins, and most of the family members may have passed away, but their story continues to inspire and comfort those who seek evidence that love is indeed stronger than death. The 1912 family reunion photograph stands as a testament to the enduring power of family bonds and the possibility that our loved ones never truly leave us, even after they have crossed over to the other side. Rose Morrison's return from the grave to participate in her family's reunion demonstrates that death may not be the final separation that we fear, but rather a temporary absence before an eternal reunion. The photograph captures a moment when the veil between worlds was lifted, allowing a family to be complete once more, with love serving as the bridge between life and death. The legacy of the Morrison family continues to this day, with their story serving as a beacon of hope for those who have lost loved ones and wonder whether they will ever see them again. The 1912 photograph proves that sometimes, just sometimes, love is strong enough to bring the dead back to life, if only for a brief and precious moment when the family can be together once more. Margaret's research had opened a window into a world where the impossible became possible, where the boundaries between life and death could be crossed by the power of love and family devotion. The Morrison family had shown that death was not the end of the story, but simply the beginning of a new chapter in the eternal saga of human relationships and spiritual connections. The photograph would remain in the archives of the Tombstone Historical Society, a silent witness to the miracle that had occurred on that September day in 1912. Future generations would look upon the image and wonder at the mystery it contained, perhaps finding comfort in the knowledge that love truly was stronger than death, and that family bonds could endure even beyond the grave. As Margaret's research became more widely known, she began receiving visitors from around the world who wanted to learn more about the Morrison family case and similar phenomena. Scientists, theologians, and ordinary people who had lost loved ones all came to Tombstone to examine the evidence and hear the story of Rose Morrison's remarkable return from the dead. The case became the subject of academic conferences, documentary films, and countless articles in both scholarly journals and popular magazines. But despite all the attention and analysis, the fundamental mystery remained unsolved. How had Rose Morrison managed to return from the grave to participate in her family's reunion? What force had enabled her to transcend the boundary between life and death? Margaret knew that she would never have all the answers, but she was content to have played a role in documenting one of the most remarkable cases of supernatural family visitation ever recorded. The Morrison family had given the world a gift, proof that love could indeed conquer death, and that the bonds between family members could endure for eternity.